Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's thrilling to see so many of you gathered here today. My name is Rebecca Volkomerson. I am your host and moderator today for this conversation with Marc, Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick and their new book, Except for Palestine. And we are very lucky to have Sandra Tamari and Samuel Shoman, who are going to be discussing the book with us. And this is a special event, I think, especially for those of us who are old Jewish Voice for Peace JVP hands. Mitchell was our first staff person back in the day. So this is a little bit of a reunion special. And so I'm really grateful for everyone who's participating and attending and really looking forward to the conversation. Before we start, I do want to thank all of our co-sponsors. And first of all, I want to give enormous thanks to JVP Central Ohio, which organized this event as one of an incredible series that they're doing that we're going to hear more about at the end of our session today. But they did an absolutely incredible job bringing this event together. So thank you to JVP Central Ohio and to our other co-sponsors, JVP National, JVP Detroit, and JVP Bay Area. So the first thing I want to do is invite Penny Rosenwasser and Henry Picciotto to join me on screen, my beloved friends and comrades, who are going to introduce Mitchell. And I'll ask everyone else maybe to turn their screens off so that we can see Penny and Henry. There we go, terrific.
Great. Hi, everyone, and congratulations, Marc and Mitchell, on your exciting book. I'm Penny Rosenwasser, and my friend and colleague, Henry Picciotto, and I were both founding board members of Jewish Voice for Peace. Henry was our board chair. There are many things to say about Mitchell, but we want to focus on Mitchell's pivotal early role in building JVP. Around 2002, when JVP was still meeting in people's living rooms, Mitchell took it on himself as a volunteer to type the meeting notes, keep the books, organize the listserv, and soon he became a Jewish Peace News editor, which award-winning poet and writer Adrienne Rich called her favorite source of news on Israel-Palestine. In 2003, our coordinating committee hired Mitchell as one of JVP's first two co-directors. As education and policy director, he became the key shaper of JVP politics, delivering astute analysis in times of quickly changing conditions. His immense intellect, unswerving dedication, and original thinking were an invaluable resource. I especially remember when he was interviewed on the PBS McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. Representing JVP at events nationwide, sometimes up against Israeli government hardliners, Mitchell spoke with clarity and compassion, drawing thousands of new supporters to us. He spoke strongly, but refused to demonize. Mitchell gave JVP his heart and soul.
Between 2003 and 2008, he put in more hours into JVP by far than any of us. In addition to the visible parts of his job, he did whatever had to be done. As an analyst and strategist, he had a commitment to a real-world orientation. He did not distort the historical record to fit a predetermined analysis. He did not propose strategies based on what would be comfortable for him personally. Rather, he looked at the world as it is and sought to build an organization that could have an impact in it. I remember one board meeting where he said, "The question is not whether we recruit hundreds or thousands of members. It's whether we influence thousands or millions of people." And this big thinking was part of his leadership in making JVP a national organization. He led our early efforts in that direction. He got in touch with local groups all over the country, met with them, answered their questions. There wouldn't be a national JVP without the work that he helped with. I'm really proud to have worked with him and learned from him. And even now, many years later, when I have a question about Israel-Palestine, it's Mitchell that I turn to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny and Henry, and thank you so much for being with us, Mitchell. It's wonderful to have you. I have the great honor to introduce Marc Lamont Hill, Samia Shoman, and Sandra Tamari, who are our other panelists. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. We're incredibly honored to have Dr. Marc Lamont Hill with us. Ebony Magazine recognized him as early as 2011 as one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. And Marc is a college professor, a scholar, an activist, a news commentator, a much sought after public speaker, an entrepreneur, a coffee lover, and a self-described book nerd. Marc received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is now a professor at Temple University, where he holds the Steve Charles Chair in Media, Cities, and Solutions. Marc is not only a prolific scholar, but also a writer. He's the author of 4 books and 2 edited volumes. And from hearing a little about them, you can start to understand the breadth of his intellectual engagement. His first book was Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, about hip hop can be used in high school classrooms to improve school attendance and test performance and help students and teachers form and articulate their identities. He also wrote The Classroom and the Cell, which is co-authored with political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, and features their weekly exchanges over the phone and by letter about a range of issues from race and mass incarceration to love and healing and the contours of Black masculinity. In his New York Times bestselling Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, from Ferguson to Flint and beyond, Marc offers not only bitter truths about the lives of Black, brown, poor, immigrant, queer, and trans people in contemporary America, but also a concluding hope in their increasing power to be recognized as somebody through collective action and community-based political mobilization. And as if putting out, except for Palestine in the past month isn't enough, Marc also recently published We Still Here, Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility. Marc appears on television and hosts a podcast called Coffee and Books. I'm a very regular listener. I listen no matter who the author is, although I will say, Marc, I hope you start doing a little bit more fiction. That's just my little request while I have you as a captive audience. He's been a news commentator on Fox and CNN, and in both cases was removed for his political positions. He currently also hosts BET News and AJ Upfront. And for this work, he has been recognized with awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, GLAAD, and the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. Marc has worked to end the death penalty, abolish prisons, release political prisoners, and stand in solidarity with human rights movements around the world, not least of which, of course, is for Palestinians. Marc is also the founder and director of the People's Education Center and the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books, which are both in Germantown, his Philadelphia neighborhood. So welcome to you, Marc Lamont Hill, and thank you so much for joining us. Samia Shoman, EDD, is a California native with Palestinian roots who has dedicated her career in public education to promoting racial and social justice in the classroom and broader educational organizations she has worked with. She is currently part of a California collaborative leading a liberated ethnic studies model curriculum coalition. For those of you who are following that battle, it has been quite a struggle and really, really incredible, impressive, important work happening there that is so important, I think, to all of us who are on this webinar. Samia currently serves as the manager of English learner and academic support programs for a Bay Area high school district. She's also the co-coordinator of the Middle East Children's Alliance Teach Palestine project. And in addition to her secondary school work, Samia served as a lecturer in the College of Ethnic Studies, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora program, and the Master of Public Health program at San Francisco State University. And last but certainly not least, my friend and comrade Sandra Tamari, who is a Palestinian organizer and the executive director of Adala Justice Project. Prior to her work with AJP, Sandra worked for 10 years in higher education as an immigration specialist, and before that as a senior program manager for Mid East, the assistant director of Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and a grant writer and researcher for Al Jannah Arab Resource Center for Popular Arts in Beirut. She's a co-founder of the St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee and was co-chair of the steering committee for the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights from 2015 to 2018. Based in St. Louis, the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson in August 2014 has greatly impacted Sandra's work. And since then, she is focused on building joint liberation efforts between Palestinians and Black communities. She was a lead organizer of the Palestinian contingent to Ferguson in October of 2014. Okay, so we have an incredible panel, as you can tell, and we're going to start getting into it. So I do want to encourage folks, as questions come up during the conversation, we're going to open it up to questions around 3 or a little after 3, but you can start putting your questions into the Q&A right away so that we can start sorting through them. So feel free to do that anytime if you hear something of interest or something occurs to you. And we're going to try to focus this conversation in particular on the implications for US politics and movement building in the US that are brought up by the book. And I do want to ask the panelists, we have a lot of questions, and we have a lot of panelists, so I want folks to sort of aim to keep your answers in the 2 to 3 minute range for all the questions so that we can hopefully get through all the questions that we're hoping to get to. So I want to start with you, Marc and Mitchell, as the co-authors of this book, and would love for one or both of you to start by talking a little bit about your vision for the impact of this book. Who are you hoping would read it, and how do you hope it will change the public conversation? I, in particular, noticed that you spoke very specifically about liberal values as the standard by which you're judging Israeli and US actions. And I think of you as people of the left. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the audience and impact in that context.
You can go first, Marc.
Okay. First of all, thank you all for the generous introductions and for welcoming us to this, inviting us to this wonderful event. I'm so excited to be in community and conversation with you. I'm always excited to talk to Rebecca. I'm always excited to talk to Mitchell, as long as we're not talking basketball.
That was coming.
And it's wonderful to meet so many new friends, and hopefully I can talk to so many of you during the Q&A. And we wrote this book. Mitchell and I we were committed to writing a book together, you know, and we decided that our focus, our talents, our politics were all sort of shaped in such a way that it would make most sense to focus on the United States. You know, we actually met on a delegation, and we actually met literally in Tel Aviv in the airport, and we had a great time on a delegation. We shared ideas, we talked, we had similar politics, and we certainly had a critique of Israeli politics, particularly the kind of rightward shift, the increase in authoritarianism that we were witnessing happening under Netanyahu and under Trump, although Trump wasn't quite president yet. But we would eventually see that. And we thought, though, it was better not to write another critique of Israeli policy or an analysis of Palestinian policies or politics or movement building. I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Israeli, neither is Mitchell, but to write as Americans who have an investment in seeing justice prevail. Who could we talk to? Who could we persuade? Who could we compel with an argument? And it seemed to me that the best place to go was the left. It was to say, what does it mean for us to have an extraordinary vision of what justice looks like, to have a critique of what's happening in the southern border, to have a problem when people who attempt to exercise free speech are challenged or undermined or marginalized or erased? What does it mean to have that kind of a politics? What does it mean to speak out against human rights abuses around the world, but say nothing about what's happening in Gaza, to say nothing about what's happening to people who are being intimidated or criminalized even for participating in BDS, regardless of what you think about BDS, just denying people the right to engage in forms of free speech, in forms of the exercise of free speech. This was the conversation we wanted to have. And we said, ideally, you know, this is something that the left should be moving on. When you ask who should be reading it, or who would we like to be reading it, obviously, as authors, we'd like everybody to be reading it. But I think for me, there are a few people who I'd love to read this, right? There are the people, the so-called PEPs, right? The people who are progressive except for Palestine, the people who are often active in our movements, who are active in the political discourse, but seem to have a blind spot on this question. I also would like policymakers to read it. I'd love if more members of Congress read it. I'd love if people who are running for governor read it. When we think about how these BDS criminalization conversations or BDS intimidation conversations have been playing out around in states around the country. And I'd love, of course, if now President Biden would sit down and flip through these pages, I think there could be something to be learned from it. We all have something to learn, but I think we have something to share as well.
Yeah, I would just add that, there's a sort of a spectrum here of people that we're talking to, and I think the farther left you go on the spectrum, the more I don't think it's a big leap to say that the farther left you go on the political spectrum, the more support for Palestinian rights you'll find. But there is the exception, people who see Palestine as somehow, a special category, Israeli crimes as somehow different or more justifiable. I mean, that goes pretty far into radical left, actually. So there's those folks, but I think we spend a lot of time in the book really discussing policy, and ultimately policy is not made, I would say, unfortunately, policy is not made by people with more radical politics, with a more radical vision. Policy in this country is not made by people who have sharp critiques of capitalism, who have sharp critiques of policing, of incarceration, of class warfare, and things like that. Politics are, and policy is made by people who are a bit more centrist. But even those people, I think when we look at, certainly when we look at the Democratic Party and we look at folks who were campaigning just a year ago in the Democratic primary, and some of the things they were talking about, there were some fairly radical ideas being bandied about. Even now, I think on domestic issues, we're seeing even somebody who's a centrist as Joe Biden, right? Having been pushed by people working really, really hard. And I'm sure many of the people that I'm speaking to right now, people who work really, really hard to push more radical ideas into Democratic politics. A lot of our fellows, however, can't seem to do this when it comes to foreign policy in general, and especially Israel-Palestine. There's always an excuse for whatever Israel does. It's a rough neighborhood, it's this and that, everybody hates the Jews, whatever it is. It's an almost constant battle just to get people whose values would seem to be very clear on so many other issues, and that it should translate into support for equal rights for Palestinians. A pretty simple principle in my view. However complicated the actual issues may be, that principle should be simple, yet somehow it isn't. And I think that's for me the core group that this book was targeted at. It was to hold a mirror up to those people and say, look, you profess a set of values, but you're not applying them in a situation where the United States, unlike, the United States obviously is the most powerful country in the world, and we do a lot of harm around the planet, and we could do a lot of good, but few situations are so transparently vulnerable to US influence as this one. And few situations have been as badly, you could say as badly handled, or as, just dealt with in a way that is immoral, or, whether you want to call it immorality or stupidity or whatever. There's not that many places where the US has done as badly as this one. And yet we can't seem to get these folks to really take a stand and say, we need a different policy. So to me, a lot of this book was about holding that mirror up to people and saying, look, your values are not matching up with what you're doing here. And so maybe you need to take a look at that.
First of all, you all couldn't see me smiling when I was imagining Biden leafing through the book, but that did make me grin a little bit. And thank you for that. That's very helpful. And Mitchell, you sort of highlighted, like you said, policymakers and the making of policy is the focus of the book. Hopefully you all have read it. You all should read it. And I think you lifted up a framework which is about the US having a set of values and them not being implemented in this particular case. And so I wanted to follow up with you, Sandra, to respond to that, about like whether that would be the framework you would articulate as a motivation for the US's foreign policy decisions, especially in the context also of domestic politics and movements and motivations. And if that framework is the one you would look at, or would look at it a little differently.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really an honor to be here to discuss this book. Brought up a lot of ideas for me. And that's, the goal of any good writing. So thank you both Mitchell and Marc. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Samia, who's doing incredible work in California. And thanks to all the organizers for inviting me in. Thank you for that question, Rebecca. I mean, I run an advocacy organization called Adala Justice Project. And our mission is, this idea that we want to de-exceptionalize Palestine. But I guess maybe I see the exceptionalization happening at a different level than maybe what Mitchell just described. More to, I think, what Marc said. We want progressives, right, to adopt Palestine as part of their value system. But from my vantage point, I guess I don't see that the US foreign policy has ever been a place where we can count on policymakers to follow their values. We have, a country that's founded, as we know, on settler colonialism and on violence and on slavery. And, as soon as the US completed its mission of colonizing this continent, it immediately looked overseas, went into the Philippines, adapted military tactics that were then brought back into our own policing. And so, I think it's this idea that somehow Israel-Palestine is a foreign policy issue is maybe the frame that I would reject. I think it's really a domestic issue. And that's where it gets exceptionalized when we're talking to people who have, interest, right, in the region. And by that, I mean, Zionist, not only Jewish Zionist, but Christian right Zionist that influence the way that foreign policy is handled on this particular issue. In that way, Israel's not an exception, really, on foreign policy. I would argue that Trump didn't move the embassy to Jerusalem primarily because of foreign policy, schemes, an ideology for his foreign policy. It was really about domestic political considerations to court the Christian right. And yes, the US government targets Palestine activists, but they also target anyone who's in opposition to capitalism and imperialism. So while BDS is being criminalized, so are indigenous and environmental organizing against pipelines, for instance. There's also, efforts in Missouri and in Florida to criminalize the blocking of highways or Black protest. So I would say, we see ourselves as definitely de-exceptionalizing Palestine at a grassroots level that we hope will influence policy. I mean, we were able to do that here in St. Louis in that, because of the relationships we built and the coalitions we built post-Ferguson, we were able to get Cori Bush into office. Cori Bush is someone who knows Palestine because of the relationships that were built. And so I think the theory of change is just a little bit different, like holding a mirror up to Biden or to policymakers. I'm not convinced that that's going to be the key, but certainly changing who those policymakers are is where my hope is.
Thank you, Sandra. And before we move on, these kinds of conversations are always the best when it's most like a conversation, not just. So I did want to see if Marc or Mitchell, if you have any response to Sandra before we move on, if you have any response or thoughts based on what Sandra said.
Yeah, just really quickly. So I'm not suggesting, believe me, that there's any part of U.S. foreign policy or domestic policy that's actually guided by ethical issues, but there is, I think, among people who advocate and who are active within their parties and within their communities, quite a bit of that. And then that is what I was referring to. And I do think that does, I think we're seeing right now with some of the things the Biden administration has done domestically, I do think we're seeing how that can translate into policy when people are pushing for it. I don't think Biden has done some of the better things that he's done in the recent weeks, which are still, in my view, as I've written a number of times, not good enough. But I don't think he's done them because out of the goodness of his heart or because he really thinks it's the right thing to do, but that he's been pushed politically. And I don't see that. I think the point that I was trying to raise, and maybe I did not do it very well, is that I don't see people bringing those values to their activism. And obviously I'm talking outside of the realm of Palestine rights activists and people who are active on the issue, people who are active within, for example, the Democratic Party, or talk about, or basically just hold liberal values. I don't see them doing that on Israel-Palestine, and I do think that's something that can change. And I also think that if that changes, it does affect policy. I don't think it's going to completely do a 180 on policy, but I do think it can affect it. And I think it's important that we communicate with our various communities that are not already on board, which, let's face it, in the United States on this issue is most of them, and tell them that their view of this actually matters. I think there is a way in which people's views on these issues do matter. And I think the fact that in the United States, I totally agree that this, Trump moves the embassy for domestic reasons, and more than any other issue that involves foreign policy, international relations, Israel-Palestine is a domestic issue. Completely agree with that statement. I think that's absolutely true. And many of our decisions, many of our policy decisions are based on those domestic forces. But part of the reason for that is that we in the United States affect this world more than anyone else. I mean, when we talk about, when we talk about who should vote, that is such an issue right now. We never actually discussed the idea that, maybe people should have something to say who are affected by our policies. And that's not just American citizens. More than any other country in the world, we affect other people. So at the same time, I would argue more than any other country in the world, most of our citizens don't give a damn about foreign policy. And I think that is a problem. And I think it's why one of many reasons why Israel-Palestine is, as you said, Sandra, a domestic issue rather than entirely a foreign policy one. So I think that is part of the de-exceptionalization. I think part of it is de-exceptionalizing foreign affairs in general and recognizing the responsibility that each one of us has as Americans for what we're doing around this entire globe. And I think Palestine is probably, in my view, and I'm obviously biased because I've been working on this issue for decades so hard, but in my view, that is a pivotal issue to do it on, maybe the pivotal issue to do it on.
Well, Marc, did you want to get in there at all in response? You're good? Okay, I think you're saying you're good.
Yeah, sorry, the unmute thing. I said, yeah, I think Mitchell I think, yeah, I'm good.
Cool. Okay, we're gonna move on. I'm gonna put my video back on while I'm talking so you can see me. We're going to move on, and I wanted to talk a little bit. We've already sort of established that the focus of the book is the Palestine exception as it plays out in foreign policy. But of course, all four of you on the panel are active, very active in the movement supporting justice for the Palestinian people in the U.S., and all of you in varying ways have experienced ostracism and attacks for your work. And in particular, it's been widely documented that people of color and Black people and Palestinians most specifically experience more serious attacks and consequences when they speak out. Just this week, or not last week maybe, we've had the example of Angela Davis's event that was just canceled at Butler University. I think this is like the third or fourth time something like that has happened to her. Marc, you've been fired from jobs. And I'm also thinking, of course, about the unrelenting attacks on people like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Stephen Salaita. The list could just go on and on and on. And then, of course, there's a related phenomena internal to the Jewish community towards Jewish people who speak out, and the ostracism and attacks that happen internal to our community. Could each of you speak from your own experience about how that plays out in your own work? And especially if there's a way that the thesis of the book can help to focus in on the cause and consequences of this problem and maybe help chart a way forward. And Marc, I wanna start with you and then move to Samia.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in my case, and I think about what happened to Angela last week, and I certainly have lost speaking engagements regularly, as recently as maybe 2 months ago. So it's not uncommon for that to happen. The CNN thing is obviously a bigger story. The kind of critique or rebuke or censure that I received from the board of trustees of my university. All of these things are part of a bigger conversation about what it means to engage in a certain type of politics at this juncture in history. And I'm inclined to agree with Sandra that it's not exclusively the question that I raise or the politics that I possess. I mean, again, there are other issues that will also earn you a certain kind of critique or marginalization, or isolation, et cetera. There are several, but this is certainly one of the issues I think that creates a problem. I think as a Black American, there is a certain kind of wariness, skepticism, and outright dismissal of Black internationalism. When we think about the work of so many Black freedom fighters, particularly in the 20th century, some of the harshest moments of critique, some of the sternest attacks that they received from either the government or from private entities came when they began to engage in a kind of global critique, but also a kind of solidarity building with other peoples of color. When we think about the work of Marcus Garvey, when we think about the work of Lorraine Hansberry, when we think about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, we consistently see this thread. Baldwin. I mean, we could go on down the list, but I'm going to focus really quickly on just Martin King and Malcolm X, heroes of mine, as the others are. Malcolm X, when he travels to the Middle East, when he makes that second last real trip to the Middle East in 64, right before he passed away February of 65, he travels briefly to Palestine. And he also spent some time with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He spent some time, of course, with Patrice Lumumba. He was trying to understand what it meant to be a colonized people, what it meant to be an oppressed people, what it meant to be on what he called the underside of democracy, or the victims of democracy, not just in the United States, but around the globe. And when Malcolm writes that piece in September of 64 in the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic, he's now entering a new space. Let me be very clear. I'm not saying that Malcolm only got criticism for critiquing Zionism. I'm saying that Malcolm had an internationalist critique. He had a critique of capitalism. He had a critique of Zionism. He had a critique of colonialism. He had a critique of Western empire. Malcolm was growing, and we've seen a long history of Black groups when they embrace that kind of critique. When Martin Luther King is beginning to say, well, wait a minute, the same spirit of nonviolence that compels me in the United States to not fight back is the same spirit that compels me to stand in Riverside Church on April 4th of 67 and give a speech on why I denounced the war in Vietnam. King's vision of Vietnam, of peacemaking, made him a threat. And the fact that he didn't want to make that last trip to the Holy Land, and he was very concerned about what had happened in the 67 war, and that he had said, I'm apt to believe that they're not going to give East Jerusalem back, or he just said Jerusalem, but obviously he was referring to East Jerusalem back. King was growing on these issues, and the international vision is what makes people a threat. And so when we make delegations, when you see the Ferguson to Palestine delegation, when you see people traveling to Europe to look at other models and visions of prisons, when you see people forming solidarity with people, whether it's in Kashmir or whether we're talking, wherever we're talking about, we're witnessing once again, not just an attempt to build consciousness, but a very harsh attack from various governments, from various movements to say, no, we want to keep people divided. We want to keep people separated. We want to undermine any ability to build a global movement, the kind of movement that we see with the non-allied movement or with Bandung. It's the kind of thing that we don't want to see repeat itself anymore. People obviously, they don't use that language, but the practice plays out that way. I know I'm taking the long way here, but for me, I just always want to be sure. I want to be very clear that, and that's the last thing I'll say. I just be very clear that the kind of critique that I get, I don't believe is purely because I'm standing up for Palestinians or standing in solidarity with Palestinians. And it's not purely because I'm challenging Israeli policy and practice, because that also invites a certain kind of conspiracy thinking that I think is actually not only inaccurate and dangerous, but also politically unsophisticated. There's something there's something else happening here, and that is whenever people were kept with poor people, brown people, black people, indigenous people, queer people, trans people, whenever people who are catching hell in this society begin to organize and build solidarity with one another, those forces that don't want to see that happen, for whose interests aren't served by that happening, rather undermine it. And that's why you see the kind of attacks that you see when I stand in the United Nations and critique Israeli policy and practice. That's the point.
Thank you so much. That was worth every single second and minute. That was incredibly powerful and beautiful, and really grateful to you for bringing in that really powerful, important historical context. Sammy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then just to give you fair warning, Sandra, you'll be next after that, and then Mitchell.
Thanks. So I want to take a second and thank Marc and Mitchell for writing this book. You know, my sister, when it first came out, bought it for me and wrote in it, "Dear Sammy, I thought you would enjoy this book." Yes, I have. You can see it's marked up with my tabs. Sandra, I feel like I'm here with a sister in struggle. So feel very honored and humbled. And I want to kind of take up this idea, you know, I know that the book, right, and the topic is thinking about the exceptionalism of Palestine in our policies, both domestic and foreign policy. But just like everything else, it's a microcosm, right? This big picture of what happens in our daily lives every day, right? And what happens in our institutions, whether that is local government policy, state policy, university and school policies, right? You talked a little bit about people speaking engagements being shut down, right? We can think about the lawsuits against SJP, right? Students for Justice for Palestine, and trying to say they cannot exist. BDS not allowed to exist. And then I think about my world, which is a secondary world, right? A lot of my time has been in high schools, and kind of when I came to the attention over 12 years ago of the JCRC, right? The Jewish Community Relations Committee and the Institute for Curriculum Services here in the Bay Area. And the dossier, I used to teach world history and contemporary world studies on my particular curriculum of teaching Israel and Palestine, its standards, it's in California curriculum, and the lack of protection, right, from administration, and how every 2 years this would come up. And I'd have administrators sitting in my classroom, right, to make sure everyone felt safe and protected. But they didn't do that to other teachers who were teaching it at the same time. Is it because I'm Palestinian and they are not, right? And they particularly are white, right? I think about a colleague of mine who happens to be Latino, and his classroom was being used when he had a prep period by a Spanish teacher. And in his classroom, he has all these flags. It was like Puerto Rico, Cuba, Palestine, Dominican, and he taught English learners all day long. Well, one particular student who was in that Spanish class did not like the Palestine flag there. It made him feel unsafe. And so the teacher was then ordered to take it down. Just that one, not the rest, right? So when we think about the exceptionalism of Palestine, here's one kid, one period, who was made, who said he felt uncomfortable. What about the Palestinian student who might have been in that class, comes the next day and the flag is gone? So that teacher responded by taking everything down, right? With a note, hey, upon request of the administration, but don't worry, because when you go to websites, right, where you're like listed as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, like Amsha, and you find my name there, the pictures of my friend's classroom are attributed to me. And so we, he kind of always jokes, fake news. And, after we finished the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, and I'll talk about that and, the control alt delete of Palestine or anything associated with it out of that later, and the headlines started to resurface around, the fact that I was the one responsible, even though we were a huge committee, for including anything on Palestine. You start to, kind of apply this rule, this accept Palestine, right? You're allowed to teach South Africa from a settler colonial framework, because we taught a big unit, every social studies teacher in our lower division team. And you can use apartheid, and we had kind of done the Truth and Reconciliation trials, and you can talk about all that, but you cannot teach anything about Palestine without putting it in the context of Israel. And even then, you can't teach certain things, right? And then you kind of, start to narrow that down around just who you are as a person, right? And the ideas that are made, or right, these imaginations. Because you're Palestinian, you must be X, Y, and Z. And I'm proud to say I am X, Y, and Z. I am anti-Zionist. I am, right, going to fight for Palestinians. I go home, I take my kids every other year for us to have a country, because you kind of feel lost, right? Like, I'm born and raised here and this is home, and we're not, we're not accepted really fully as a full human being in our identity here. And you go back home and you're also not accepted, right, fully with your identity. And so I just think about, this exceptionalism of Palestine in policy, foreign and domestic, trickles down to everybody's daily lives, including the experiences they have in school. I think about my own kids who are now in the 4th grade, and my daughter, her name is Palestine. And so, yes, I did. She has a twin brother. His name is Jihad. And what is the experience, right, that they are going to have? And we did that so they can open up conversations. And don't worry, until they were 5 years old, my mom was still like, it's not too late. It's not too late. You can change their names. But luckily, they've been back home. The nerves come when we get to the border, because we usually cross from Jordan. My husband's family lives in Jordan. They were refugeed from the 48 war. And, so far, it's all good. And we've traveled, but every time, right, you wonder, it's like, oh my God, is this going to be the time? So all that to say, kind of taking the big picture and how, what's happening and what's discussed in the book around, presidential policy and what Trump did, having, right, a long history. He just actually acted on it, right, to BDS, to what's happening in Gaza, all kind of trickles down and can be seen when these attacks happen on people like Marc, myself, Angela Davis, and the list goes on.
Thank you so much. That was so powerful to hear those really, really concrete examples. And I think that the establishment of that, the continuum of that trickle down from top to bottom and how it plays out is, really helps to expand the ideas in the book. Sandra, let me pass it to you.
Thank you. Oh, Samia, that was so beautiful. And I love that your kids are Philistine and Jihad. My grandmother wanted me to name my son Jihad, and I didn't have the guts. So God bless you. He's Jad instead. But I'm glad you talked about taking your kids and going home. Being in the homeland was such an important part of my young adult years. When I went to university at the University of Florida, I decided to study Arabic because I wanted to understand my dad. I just didn't understand him as well as I thought I could. And his whole history, both my parents are Palestinian, but my mother grew up in the US, so she doesn't speak Arabic. But my dad, would recite Arabic poetry and listen to Kulthum night and day. And, it was just a thing that I wanted to explore just to get to know him more. And so I became, a student of Arabic as an undergraduate, and then had opportunities to travel to Palestine as a student, and then later as a professional. My first trip was when I was 20 years old. Your JVP's next guest, Anan Amari, who has a beautiful memoir that was just published, was one of my mentors. And so I went with a group that Anan was part of, called New Generation for Palestine. I was 20 years old. It was the first Intifada, and my political education happened in Palestine, in that environment. And I had opportunities to go back many times in that following decade, getting to know my father's family, being able to live for periods of time in my father's childhood home, getting to know my cousins, to work as a human rights worker on political prisoner issues, to just hike in the beautiful land of our villages. It seems like a lifetime ago, but I really treasure that grounding in the realities of Palestine that I got in that time. And it really shapes who I am today, and shapes the way I see the world. I took about a decade off to raise kids. My kids are young adults now. And it was during Cast Lead, during the war on Gaza in 2008, 2009. I was living in Beirut, My husband's an academic. He had sabbatical. He was doing research at the American University in Beirut. And we were living there and watching the horrific pictures of what was happening in Gaza from up close. And being able to talk to people, Palestinians living in the camps and Palestinians that were doing work in Lebanon during that period was devastating, was really devastating. And it was a constant barrage of violence and death that we were seeing. So I came back to the US after that period and rededicated myself to being active again after that period of parenting. And here in St. Louis, we started a really beautiful multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial, organizing circle that focused on BDS campaigns. We had really successful cultural boycott campaigns, working with Black organizers to pull out of an Israeli-sponsored hip hop event at Washington University. That was very early on in 2010. Then we won a campaign to get rid of a city contract with Veolia. And Palestine was very much like the center of that campaign. We developed really close relationships with Black environmental and labor organizers at that time. And then I tried to go back to Palestine in 2012. And I wasn't allowed in. Israel denied me entry. I was put into the detention at the airport and sent back home the following day. And I don't talk about this a lot from this personal perspective, what I lost, what I've been missing, since then, because obviously my case is really just one of many. Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians are exiled. I am one of the very lucky ones. When I was living in Beirut, I didn't really want to admit that I had been to Palestine because Palestinians there dream of their homes and dream of their villages. And here I am with all this privilege, an American passport, and had been there, dozens of times. But the loss is so staggering. I have a whole generation of young cousins that I've never met at this point. I've lost, touch with close friends. I keep imagining a time when we all can go back. But it's just a real sadness and sometimes even a resentment I feel when, when Jewish Americans and other non-Palestinians, casually, travel to Palestine. I'm not talking about political delegations or solidarity visits, but I'm talking about these very casual, like, oh, my trip for the summer. And so every summer I have to brace myself. Sometimes I have to, get off of social media so I don't see those kinds of posts. But it does fuel my resolve for all of us to return together, and just that there's a price to doing this work that hits you very personally.
Sandra, thank you so much for sharing such personal reflections and really making it real for all of us, the real sense of loss that that experience entails. Mitchell, let me turn it over to you.
So first of all, with time being short here, I realized that I did not thank Penny and Henry for their wonderful introductions. And seriously, guys, you moved me just about to tears. You couldn't quite see it maybe on the camera, but you did. That was really lovely, and thank you very much. And I'm glad actually that Sandra brought up the question of privilege, since here I am of the four of us here on this panel. I am the white male, and there is clearly a difference here. Also, Israel-Palestine is what I do for a living, right? It's what I've been doing for a living since I was hired at JVP almost 20 years ago. So my situation is different. That being said, I have also explicitly been told that my association with JVP cost me at least, that I had gotten a job and that board member had intervened in that organization and said that they can't hire me because of my association with JVP. Just recently, nowadays I make a lot of my living as a writer, and just recently a place that I write for or had written for regularly basically froze me out over, I suspect, this book, although it wasn't entirely clear. And that's what happens to me, okay, despite the privilege. And that's, I mean, absolutely nothing compared to the stories that you guys have just heard, right? And I found that it's, for me anyway, one of the things that's been crucial in the work that I've been doing over the past few years has been to document the fact that there's a lot of consequences for many people who speak out for Palestinian rights, but there is a clear difference, and I think this goes back to what Marc was saying. There's a clear difference when it's people of color. It is not a coincidence that that when Michelle Alexander, when Marc, Angela Davis, Ilhan Omar, we can go down a very, very long list. Whenever anyone who is a person of color, let alone Palestinian, speaks out about Palestinian rights, there's almost a mob mentality that comes down on them, and it's really, really quick. So a few years ago, I remember I had started writing some op-eds for the Forward, and that was just after Ilhan Omar had been elected, and she, made her Benjamin's remark, I think, or one of them. And not only did the Forward just go after her like with torches and pitchforks, while also getting a few people to write an op-ed here and there to make it look, to give the appearance, in my opinion, to give the appearance of balance. But they actually, and this was what sent me over the edge, they actually sent a fundraising appeal based on, look at how we go after anti-Semites like Ilhan Omar. And from then on, I have not only did I stop writing, and I was very clear publicly that I would never write for them again, but also I won't even click on their stuff. When something that I need to see is in the Forward, I ask someone else to tell me about it. That's just, it's a small thing, but it's, I think, all too typical. And part of it is this need, I think, to find an anti-Semitism, quote unquote, on the left that is much greater than what actually exists. But I think a bigger part of it is the fear of solidarity. I think the scariest thing that happened to Israel advocates in this country over the past, maybe ever, was the solidarity between the protesters in Ferguson and people in Gaza. I think that connection scared the hell out of people because it's powerful and it means a lot. And it does not, in my experience, have anything to do with anything other than a shared experience of oppression. And that's really the thing. Gaza, in this instance, Gaza could be anywhere. It's not that it's exactly the point that it's not an exception, that Israel here is not an exception. It is a shared experience of Black people in America and Palestinians living under siege in Gaza for all this time, that there's a resonance there. And it's not because of Israel's particularly being an oppressor, although I do think the parallel of both the United States and Israel being settler colonial states is important there. But it isn't anything specific to Israel other than Israel's actions in besieging Gaza. And I think that really, really scared people. I think it scared Israel advocates. And I think ever since then, they have been absolutely on the warpath to stamp out any budding solidarity between Palestine and the issue of Palestine and the issue of racial racism in the United States. So, to me, that was very striking. And it's been a place that, at least for me, has been a necessary focus as a white person. I think it's really important for those of us who are in that privileged position to use that position to say, hey, look at this thing, because not only is it morally important, but it's also strategically important.
Thank you so much, Mitchell, for both for naming your positionality here and also connecting the dots across different movements and starting to bring in the concept of solidarity, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more before time together is through. I have one more set of questions before we open it up to our audience. And I want to hear all of your brilliance. And I also want to ask maybe that just to be a little bit concise in your answers for this last set of questions, only because we do want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. But I do want to continue on this theme of us thinking together about the ways the analysis in this book is useful to or illustrated by local and grassroots organizing efforts. So I want to turn it over to Samia and Sandra to talk a little bit more detail about your local organizing work and how that might echo or amplify or maybe even contradict some of the themes in the book.
Yeah, I can start if that's okay. I think about, right now I'm working with the Save Arab American Studies Coalition, which, we did not save it necessarily in the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum. So 2 years ago, there was a panel of 18 of us, 3 writers and 2 kind of facilitators that were brought on by the California Department of Education to create a model ethnic studies curriculum. And from that first draft to what it is now, it's like, being here and then going to a different country. And that was really due to kind of right-wing Zionist pressure to essentially erase Palestine and Palestinians out of the curriculum and keep a very watered down version of a lesson on Arab Americans. And having had multiple conversations, right, with leaders at the CADE, like, okay, well, we want you to write a lesson. Can you write a lesson? But, it has to be acceptable. Acceptable to who? What is the criteria by which a lesson that would include something about Palestine or Palestinians, which is a central issue, right, of Arab American identity, regardless of what country you're from, everyone knows that. What is the criteria of acceptability, right? And it goes back to that kind of piece around exceptionalization. Like, well, it can't include Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. It cannot include Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. So we cannot teach children in public school about publicly elected congresswomen who are serving our country. Go on, right? And so all of these pieces have brought together a broad-based coalition of people who are doing organizing work, not just Arabs, right? We have solidarity with African-American scholars, Asian American Pacific Islander, Latino, Latinx, Chicano, Chicanox. And it is a broad-based coalition who says, you know what? We will continue on this, fight with the state in what's happening, but we're also going to support what we now are calling a liberated ethnic studies curriculum that is being created by the majority of the people on that panel and additional educators from all over California, from all of the different fields, right? And, we don't consider that, allyship. We do consider it kinship, right? We all know that kind of famous quote of, my liberation is tied to yours, right? And so it is disappointing, though, when you do see leaders, right, and leaders of color kind of cave into that political pressure and that fear, right, because they know what will happen if they don't. And so I do think that this book has a lot of implications for people in these positions that are making local decisions around whether it's, education, local government policy. And I heard, when they were talking about, who should read the book, the piece around the governors, because our governor here, actually the first bill to require ethnic studies as a grad requirement in high schools was vetoed under the pressure of, we don't like the curriculum that's being drafted right now, so you can't sign the bill until we have something that's acceptable to us. And we know where that pressure was coming from. I mean, we've seen the articles being written, the op-eds being published, the public comments in the thousands, in the over 20,000s, basically saying you cannot include BDS, you cannot include this, you cannot include that, you cannot include this, and we won't support a curriculum until all of that is gone. And so there it is, now it's gone. So I would say kind of the two themes there are, we have run a parallel track in kinship, right, in solidarity with all of these other groups, right, these progressive left groups who said, wow, you didn't really, right? I have colleagues now working on this who said, I was kind of in my little bubble of whatever, Chicanx studies or, you know, Latinx studies. And I had no idea till I showed up in an article with you. It was somebody else was mentioned, one of the writers. And she said, what this really meant. I kind of always said I'm supportive of Palestine, but I never really centered the work in my work. So I do think this book has a lot to say to audiences like that, right? And people who say like, yes, I am for justice, for human rights, and especially, right, in ethnic studies, for liberation and decolonialism, then you have to include us, right? And then I think it can do a lot of work for people like, you know, our superintendent of public instruction and friends. I'll just say that.
Thank you. That's again such a concrete example of the way this stuff plays out and what the impacts are. Sandra, how about you?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I mean, Samia really gave a really concrete example. I want to remind us that, you know, the organizing that's happening now to make it clear that Palestine is a feminist struggle is where I'd like to go. We all remember the attacks on the Women's March, you know, and, you know, Tamika and Linda got, you know, so much, they paid such a huge price for their outspokenness. But then, you know, in 2019, Zahra Bello was forced off of the board of the Women's March because of her stance on Palestine. And the Women's March says something that's really baffling, like they're not going to take a stance on international issues because they just don't want to get involved anymore. And it just the idea that this, you know, that women in the US can wash their hands of militarism and not talk about US imperialism and be happy in their little suburban bubbles is very laughable, right? They're obviously making that Palestine exception because they just don't want to touch it anymore. Done. We're not going to have that conversation. So a new collective that Samia and I both belong to is the Palestinian Feminist Collective, which is really demanding an intersectional decolonial feminism that, you know, is evidenced by the repression of Palestinian women here in the US, as Samia is, you know, alluding to, and evidenced also by the state violence that is being, you know, carried out in our homeland with US funding, right? There are so many expressions of this gendered kind of violence in Palestine. I don't want to get into that, but really trying to push US feminists to adopt this idea that they embrace Palestine as a central issue, a core issue to their organizing. And Tali just dropped into the chat a pledge that you can take, that Palestine is a feminist issue that really, you know, is looking for individuals and especially organizational sponsors. So, you know, this is another way that we're trying to push Palestine onto the progressive agenda.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that angle in, Sandra. Thank you. Before we open up to questions, just real quick, Marc or Mitchell, I'm curious, especially since you've been immersed in these themes in the writing of the book, if you heard anything that sort of sparked any thoughts about in terms of how it relates either to your own current work or to stuff you brought up in the book.
Well, the one thing I'll say is, you know, and we talk about this at the end of the book, there's a way that despite all of the frustration and legitimate outrage at how so many activists are being sort of engaged and treated, that we're still making considerable progress. There's still so much room for hope. And so as I think about the organizing work that I do in Philadelphia and around the country, I'm seeing those bonds of solidarity forged more often than ever. When I think about the work we did in Ferguson or the work I've seen done in Minnesota, et cetera, I'm noticing that the question of Palestine, the conversation about Palestine, I should say, is more prominent. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Is more prominent now than ever before. That there's a more radical politic being articulated than ever before. And so this generation of students, you know, forming SJPs you know, is something very different than what I saw on campuses that I was attending even 20 years ago. And so there's considerable room for hope. And it seems to go along with the polling that we see, you know, the kind of, if we look at the American response post Operation Protective Edge, if we look at the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren took more progressive positions on Palestine than any other mainstream candidate in recent previous years. I'm not saying they're entirely progressive positions, but simply more progressive than anything that their peers were saying. And yeah, they didn't win, but they didn't lose because of those positions. All of those things are signposts to me of a kind of possibility that still remains in front of us. I'm very excited and energized about. And I think we see that in our local and national and indeed international organizing efforts.
Love that. Thank you for bringing in hope. Organizing is all about hope. So we have a lot of great questions, not a ton of time. And I think one of the things I'm really enjoying about this discussion is how we're sort of ranging all the way from like internationalism to like very specific things like school curriculums and everything in between, and sort of exploring how these themes, you know, hit in every single way. And there's a question from the audience saying that's about Congress. So the question is, there's an audience among the edge of the Democratic Party, represented by the Justice Democrats, who, for example, helped get Cori Bush elected. How can we continue to make it not okay to call yourself a progressive and make an exception of Palestine? So that can go to any one of you who feels moved to answer.
Okay, can I want to jump on this first, only partly because I have thoughts on it, but also I have a live, my television show, which is now daily on Black News Channel, starts at 8, and so I have to dip out just a little bit early. And so I wanted to make sure that I got a thought or two in on this. First of all, I think we have to begin by the term progressive except for Palestine or PEP is something that we say, and it's a wonderful phrase, or it's a wonderful framework for describing a certain kind of person. But what we don't want to do is reify that term in such a way that we act like that's a morally tenable position, right? Like it's not a quirk. You know, it's an action. Like you can't be progressive except for rape culture. You can't be progressive except for housing and injustice. You know, I'm progressive except for the environment. Like you can't be progressive except for white supremacy. Like these aren't things that we can do. And so progressive except for Palestine, we have to frame that not merely as a kind of ideological quirk of a certain type of liberal, but rather as a morally untenable position and a site of it should be a site of intense criticism and ultimately rejection. That's the first. That's also the way that we get to the place of not allowing our members of Congress or other elected officials to have this position, because we almost accept it as an article of faith that if you're going to run for office, that this might be one of your things, but that they're good otherwise, and they're as good as it gets, and we can't begin from that place. I think, you know, Ilhan Omar always says, you get what you organize for, right? And others have said it, of course, as well. But I always think about her and that idea that, you know, you get what you organize for. I think that in the same way that we moved Bernie to the left on this question, right? Now, Bernie also studied and read, and he had great people like Matt Duss, giving him instruction, but he's also pushed on this issue. Elizabeth Warren was certainly pushed on this issue. We have to push people on this issue. And I think for me, obviously the Palestinian community and the Palestinian American community will be doing that. But it's super important for me as the Black American citizen who's in a district with no Palestinians almost, to still tell my member of Congress, in this case it's Dwight Evans, hey, where do you stand on this question? Where do you stand on this issue, this policy, that policy? And not allow that to be an untenable, or not allow that to be a tenable position to take, right? If he supports the occupation, but is really good on tax policy, like that's not okay. And most politicians, unfortunately, don't have feelings; they have interests. And so, if we can push them in such a way that their interests converge with ours, then we get somewhere. But too often, I think we let them off the hook on this other issue. And so, for me, that's the organizing work we have to do. I don't expect politicians to have some conversion experience. I mean, some will, right? But I think it's more important for us to see a Jamal Bowman be successful or Cori Bush be successful and say, okay, let's use that same energy on Richie Torres. And not just allow that to slip through because he's incredibly progressive on other things.
Let's please use it on Richie Torres. Does anyone else have very urgent feelings about this question? Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay, Mitchell.
Yeah. I mean, first, one thing that I think is just really important, and I think we just need to acknowledge and support each other in dealing with. If you speak out for Palestinian rights, you're going to be called an anti-Semite. It's going to happen. And so the question is, how do we avoid that? Is the wrong question. You can't avoid it. And we shouldn't avoid it. We should take it on. And being Jewish is not believe me, is not a shield. If you're Jewish, you will also be called anti-Semitic. We need to support each other because it's a horrible thing to have to endure. We need to defend each other from those charges. We need to address it. And I think this is part of, I think the example of Cori Bush actually for me is a really apt one and a really inspiring one, because Cori Bush takes on things. Her style has been to confront what is being hurled at her, not to ignore it and say, just roll off my back. She confronts, she responds to it. It is important, I think, in progressive communities to fight against anti-Semitism. And I think, we look at some of the most prominent activists for Palestinian rights are also fighting against anti-Semitism when they're confronted with it, when they see it, as with every other issue. It is part of that entire, the vast struggle that I'd like to think that we're all part of. That is so the question of how do we avoid it is the wrong question. The way we deal with it is to support one another, is to defend one another, and not in a not from a place of I mean, I know I use the word defend, but not from a place of defensiveness, actually, but of taking it on as the cynical tactic it is. Because here's in the olden days, there were various policy arguments as to why, Cold War arguments, this and that, as to why American policy towards Israel and Palestine was what it was. Most of those are just not effective anymore. And what we have now is that every time the pro-Israel forces are arguing, it is constantly with the refrain of if you're criticizing Israel, you're anti-Semitic. This is what they are. This is dominated their playbook. Why? Because they're losing the argument. This is actually a sign that the movement for Palestinian rights is making a lot of progress. It is that conversation is not just expanding; it's being heard. It isn't just being conducted. People are understanding. People, and for a variety of reasons. They can be ethical reasons. It can be because they have watched Cast Lead on TV. They watched Protective Edge. They saw what Israel did in Gaza. They have seen time and time again films of settlers and soldiers doing the things that they do. And maybe people now are looking at it and seeing not just those incidents, but the systemic oppression of Palestinians, both in the West Bank, Gaza, and within Israel, and in all the refugee camps surrounding those territories. It is there, and this is a sign of winning. These accusations of anti-Semitism suck. It is a terrible thing to be called an anti-Semite. The history of anti-Semitism in our culture, in European culture, in the United States, is loathsome and terrible, and it is a horrible thing to call another person. And yet it becomes used so often that many people are even desensitized to it, because it has been used and abused to such a great extent. So when that is the question that's coming up, I think we need to turn it around and say, how do we just, how do we support each other through it? How do we respond to it? And how do we understand that this is actually a sign of progress?
Thank you. And sorry, it's still pandemic life over here in this house, so I have children running through. I want to throw out another question from the Q&A, and Samia or Sandra, you can either take on the first question or this question in particular, whichever one you like, because it will probably be one of the last questions we get to ask. But apparently from the chat, there were several people from participants saying that, like, given the many urgent vulnerabilities that people face around the world that the US impacts by its actions and inactions, wanting to hear more about why the conditions of Palestinians warrant, in particular, attention and resources.
You know, I think that one of the things that we say at Adalah Justice Project is we don't particularly need more Palestine advocates. We need human rights advocates. We want people who are not only de-exceptionalizing Palestine, but de-exceptionalizing Israel. Israel is not the only purveyor of human rights abuses on the globe. You know, it's not the only occupying power. We understand Palestine as an anti-colonial movement that has deep roots in third world politics, as Marc was alluding to, and Black internationalism and all of those, you know, great traditions. And it's a, you know, we are under attack because we are a radicalizing force wherever we go. We're putting out ideas that are revolutionary. And so it's not a surprise, right, that we're under attack in this country. It's not a surprise that we're being repressed in the Arab world. It's not a surprise that Israel is doing all it can, right, to tamp down on revolutionary parties, on socialist parties, on Islamist parties that have, you know, radical ideas. So, you know, we need to be, you know, obviously, it's a big task, right, to do this. But what I mean by being a human rights advocate is that we have principles, and we apply those principles universally. And you know, that's where Palestine, you know, can no longer be the exception.
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
I would just add to everything that Sandra shared is, you know, the length of time. You look at the length of time that this has been going on, and the fact that we're not making progress, it's going backwards, right? In this conversation, when we keep talking about, besides human rights, democracy, no one wants to talk about one democratic state with equal rights for all people who live within its borders, right? And so why is that also an exception when you think about what's happening around the world, right? No one wants to play human rights or oppression Olympics, but I would just say contextualize what's happening in how long it's been happening, and the fact that, you know, where you might see pieces or you think that there's progress because of certain narratives being put out, the reality is something different, right? The reality is something different. And then the application of this idea of, you know, democracy and why, you know, it's a little different, right? In Israel when it comes to Palestine, and considering, you know, that one state and this romanticism of that a two-state kind of solution could be a reality. So I think, you know, all situations need to be contextualized, but to answer the question of, like, why is this so important and why right now? And then I think for the US, it's think about all of our domestic issues, right? And the way, I don't know, even city neighborhoods, parks and recs are funded, and the amount of billions and trillions of dollars being poured into maintaining the status quo in Israel and Palestine. And so I'll leave it there.
Great. As usual, there's never enough time to get to all the questions we want to get to. And Marc, I know you have to go shortly. So I did want to ask you each, Marc and Mitchell, to spend a minute or two as a final wrap up, adding in anything you didn't get to say that you want to say, and just basically like how you see the next stage of the struggle in the context of the current political moment, and in particular, your plans or hopes for the book in that context. So Marc, if you're still here for one final word, are you still here for one final word is a better question. Mitchell, why don't we start with you, and we'll see if Marc's still available.
All right. So in terms of the book, you know, I'm hoping that that we get to build the connections that we established in the book that speak to what I see happening in the United States. I mean, the stresses of the past 4 or 5 years have, in fact, brought out some of the best in organizing in the United States, some of the best in ideas and thinking, and have legitimized notions that, seem to be marginalized or fringe before. I don't think Palestine is part of that yet, but I think it can be, and I think it is. It's having that be part of the broader conversation is what I think is really important. Look, I've been working in foreign policy in one way or another, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal, whether it's apartheid South Africa, Central America. I've been working in this field since the 80s. And one of the things that I do see happening now, and I've seen it before and it has petered out, so I hope it lasts this time, is a sense that things cannot get better here if our collective behavior in the world and the world around us doesn't also get better, that it is all part of, that this sort of neat concept of separating domestic and foreign policy, not just in the United States, but in general. This world is connected. And so all of these issues resonate there and here. So, one of the most common questions I've gotten over many years is this question: why should I care about Palestine when I have all of these issues here in the United States that are very important? And it's not either or. It's all part of the same struggle. And, I'm hoping that our book helps to build that bridge, reinforce that bridge, and cement that idea for people.
Fabulous. Marc, I see you're back. We want to give you a chance to give one more wrap up, anything that you are dying to say, and in particular about sort of the political context going forward and the role of the book in it, and what you're hoping for in terms of the the next stage of the struggle in the context of the current political moment.
Unmute yourself.
At
Marc.
some point, I'm going to learn how to unmute Zoom. I always, think about where we've been and where we are now. I remember being at Gustavus Davis College in Minnesota with Angela Davis about 10 years ago, and we were talking about prison abolition. And I remember saying to her, "Wow, this is really weird. Talking about prison abolition right now, people think we're nuts." And she said to me, yeah, but she said there was a time 20 years ago where just the conversation about prison itself, forget abolishing them, just having critiques of the prison itself was so unpopular and was so sort of off the mainstream path that I would not be allowed in universities. I'd be, rejected from universities for even mentioning prisons in polite company, in decent company. And she said, look at us, now we're having a conversation about abolition. And while we're marginal, we're at least able to have the conversation. I'm looking now 10 years later, and people are talking about defunding police. They're talking about abolition, not as a marginal discourse, but as a mainstream discourse. I mean, look at Minnesota, in the Minneapolis defunding movement, or Camden, et cetera. Things have a way of seeming like they're not moving until they've moved, and then so much happens. We wrote this book at a moment in history. Honestly, we thought Donald Trump would probably be president for another 4 years when we wrote this book. I started this book before I gave the UN speech. Mitchell and I were planning this book before I ever got fired. I mean, so much has changed in the process of writing this book, some positively, some incredibly deflating. But at the end of the day, when I look at the grand kind of sweep of time, 50 years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, we're winning. We are winning. And what we offer in the book, I think, is a sober analysis of what the blind spots are and how we get there, the cultural forces, the political movements, the taken for granted logics that allow someone that allow the progressive, except for Palestine, identity to exist and even prevail. But we also, again, I don't want to keep going back to hope, because this isn't like a hope that is born out of blind optimism. This is what Du Bois referred to as a hope not hopeful, but not hopeless, but unhopeful. He said a hope not hopeless, but unhopeful. We don't think we're just going to win, but we know that if we organize and struggle, we can. What JVP does gives us a chance to fight and win. The solidarity movements we're building gives us a chance to fight and win. Pressuring these politicians gives us a chance to fight and win. And what we hope to do with this book is offer just a tiny slice of analysis. Not speaking for Palestinians, not speaking for Israeli Jews, not speaking for anybody but ourselves, but to speak to our peers, to speak to our comrades, speak to our fellow citizens in the United States, to give them a tiny slice of analysis to equip them to help us win just a little bit more, to make a win a little bit more likely. And so as troublesome as this moment remains, Biden's not moving the embassy back. Who knows what's going to happen, with the 78th Israeli election, right? But what we know for sure, right, is that we are better equipped than ever. We're more organized than ever. This generation of activists is more is more prepared and engaged and progressive than many before them. Not everybody, but many before them. I've never been more certain that we're going to win. I have never been more confident, more certain at any moment in my life than this moment right now that we will be victorious in our struggle for peace, justice, dignity, and self-determination for everybody. I'm certain of it. We just got to keep fighting. And I hope, and I think I can speak for Mitchell and say we both hope that this book plays just as one drop in that ocean, just plays one tiny role in helping us be victorious. And finally, I want to say thank you to JVP, because the role you play is much larger. The commitment that you demonstrate every single day is helping make this world more safe, more free, more just. And I'm thankful to you all for inviting us, but more importantly, for the work that you do every single day.
Thank you. I feel like I can still say thank you on behalf of JVP as a proud member, former staff person. Before we turn it, and thank you for that beautiful vision of hope. And I hope that's what everyone can take away, that we are going to win. And we are working every day to win. And before I turn it over to the wonderful Amy Schuster, who has been incredible in building this event and who has exciting announcements about the next events that are coming that I hope everyone will stick around for, I did want to give you each just a minute. Samia and Sandra, I'm sorry that it's going to be short, but if you have any final thoughts or that you want to share, I'd love to give you just a minute to bring them out. So Samia.
Yeah, I'll try to be less than a minute and just say, I feel like, thank you, Marc. I am always try to work from a place of hope and, thinking about just the four of us and how many more of us there are, right? This solidarity, this kinship is what is going to get us there. All the people listening, right? All the people who are going to read the book, I think then make lots of drops in the ocean until we get a swell going. So thank you again for the book and the work and for, being here, because I do believe eventually we will get there.
Amen. Samia, this is great. And I think that I've been thinking a lot about Fred Hampton. Obviously, he's back in popular imagination with the film. And I interviewed the movement attorney that represented his family recently, Armando Weiss, check it out. And just thinking about, the multiracial and working class kinds of coalitions that were attacked. This is where power lies. And, we make policy. Policy is on us. And so, I also share Marc's hope. Obviously, things in the homeland are deteriorating. I mean, there is active colonial erasure of Palestinians happening today. So we have very urgent work to do, but I believe that in this country, we can shift things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for such a wonderful conversation. I learned so much and got really inspired as well. So Amy, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Palestine is a feminist issue. PEP should not be reified as a real thing. We need to continue to push people on this issue, regularly asking our representatives to keep track of Palestinian rights and making clear statements about vaccine availability. We need to continue to support each other against these cynical charges of anti-Semitism. We need more human rights advocates and advocates for democracy. The movement for Palestinian rights is having really important inroads, and and we are part of a movement to try to make a more just, a more safe, a more democratic future. Just real, you know, I'm trying to kind of pull it all together, and I just am getting so much from this, and I'm so appreciative to Samia and Sandra and Marc and Mitchell for speaking with us today about this issue. Rebecca, thank you so much for kind of taking us through these questions. I also want to thank Tali and Gemma, Stephanie, for all the support from National. Actually, we really could not have made any of this possible without their work. And JVP Detroit, JVP Bay Area, Penny, Henry in particular, and my fellow people here in JVP Central Ohio. Michael always makes everything beautiful. Connie keeps us coming together. Farrell keeps us connected to what's real. Bonnie keeps us well fed. I mean, none of this ever happens with all the many little people in our lives that make everything possible. I wanted to ask Tali one more favor. If you could share the final slide, or if you'd like me to share the final slide. I'd like to tell you about our upcoming conversations and invite all of you to come. Thank you all so much for attending this event. We're hoping that it has fed you as much as it has fed me. Our next event is actually with an author who has written a new memoir. Anana Mary is just a wonderful activist, educator, author, and we're going to bring her into conversation with Dalia Gomez, which is somebody who is a sort of scholar of Arab American biography, literature, and sort of transnational feminism more broadly. So we're super excited for that conversation, and hope that you will join us for that. And then we're super honored to have Omar Barghouti actually joining us in conversation in June. That'll be June 1st. So if you're not already on our list, by all means, just visit our Facebook page. We also will have a recording of this event made available to everyone. JVP Central Ohio has a YouTube channel, and you can just search us there and find our previous conversations about Jeff Halper, who is making the case for one democratic state, and previous conversations with We Are Not Numbers, and would really encourage all of you to leave this and go and look at some of the stories that are posted on that website of young people in Gaza who are sharing just beautiful stories of their life, regardless of the inhumane conditions that they're living under. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and we very much hope to see you in the future. Take care.